Today we're doing something a bit different. I decided to record the process of making the gingerbread map. These two work weeks are probably going to mark the last time that I work on monster maps for a while, so I wanted to capture the process because it's always nice to see how things change over time. I didn't have a plan going into this map, but I'm pretty satisfied with how it turned out. You can see here that I'm making tweaks to the gingerbread man itself. Oftentimes when I go back to the game, I realize that things look kind of weird, so I always end up tweaking things a bit. Even though the main purpose of the task is to make the map, I think it's often useful to have multiple iterations of working on graphics. I think it especially helps because I don't have any training on how to make things look proportional, but fortunately it's possible to detect weird discrepancies through trial and error and continuously coming back to the graphics. I was gonna make this video about the things that I learned in my first year of self-employment, but honestly, the more I think about it, the more I feel like it's just a random stream of thoughts. I've learned so much over the year. Since it's a huge topic, maybe I'll hold off on it until another day. Or maybe it's an indication that I should make different kinds of videos where I'm able to touch on these thoughts every now and then, rather than all at once. And even trying to distill 1 year of lessons feels like a questionable task because what is the purpose of it? With this map, I wasn't sure where to go because I don't really think there is a natural habitat for gingerbread. I thought about drawing a gingerbread house, but we already have something very similar for the grandma map. So I thought about instead making it a very optimistic map where perhaps you have a pot of gold and it's at the end of rainbows or something, and then the NPC for the map could be a leprechaun. But that seems a bit too much off theme. I've ended up giving each map some of its own flexibility, because there's really no reason why everything needs to be very uniform or make perfect logical sense. I think almost a month ago now, I was talking about how I felt really disappointed and frustrated, and perhaps it has something to do with how I was approaching daily life. Since then, I have made a lot of changes to kind of correct the course. So I've been thinking a lot about the structure of the game development process and whether it's too rigid. I think one of the benefits of self employment is that you're able to have the freedom to decide what works for you. It is a freedom in some way, but it's also just a huge responsibility. So far, I've taken a pretty structured approach where I track how many hours tasks will take before each 2 week work period starts. Then every day, I would write down and track how long each task took and aim to effectively continuously increase that time. But there's only so far that you can continuously increase the time, and I think in some ways I suspect that this work style is treating myself too much as a machine. I think it's still very important to have a goal for what you want to accomplish and to have a realistic idea of how long it will take so that your plans can actually come to fruition. But tracking time so closely does feel kind of suffocating and adds to the pressure that makes it harder for me to take a break. So, what I've been doing for the past month or so that I think is helping is I've continued to create goals for each 2 week period, but I'm no longer tracking day by day how long things are taking or how much I've accomplished. 'Cause I don't think humans can really work every single day. So, I want to build a great foundation for creativity because as I work on the game and think about what kind of environment do I want to create, I don't think I have all of these answers right now, and I think I probably have a lot more to learn. So these balloons are inspired both by a painting that I have and also by this Toontown trap attack, where you could drop huge weights on a monster. The two main constraints that I had for this map is I wanted to have a willow tree, so you can see that I'm drawing that now. And I also need to have these gingerbread drop ginger, because it's a necessary ingredient for other systems in the game. Creating a fictional world is pretty difficult, especially if it's a world where people spend their time. Even when it comes to building things like a game's economy, you have to think about who is going to be the winners and losers and how are you going to balance it out? Or are you just going to have an infinitely growing number? And the most fun that the player will get is through watching that number grow. But then you have to think about what does that kind of gameplay teach people? Because I think games can also train different skills or teach you a new way of interacting with people. When I was younger, I certainly learned a lot about building businesses and a bit about work ethic by mindlessly grinding for hours. I was watching a video recently, and unfortunately, I didn't write down the quote, so I can't repeat it exactly. But they were saying essentially that oftentimes when people are creating something entirely new, they often just make a perfect model of reality as it is, as opposed to trying to be creative and figure out how reality could be or what kind of systems would be more beneficial. And they were essentially encouraging people to use art as an avenue to re envision things versus just reproduce them. So that's what I'm trying to do. I want to create a fairly relaxing game where there isn't a lot of brutal competition, but there's still a lot of interesting things that you can do within the world. And there are avenues for non prescriptive gameplay, so people can create things of their own in some ways. So the game can be more of a respite rather than yet another thing that is trying to take all of your attention. Speaking of attention, I think in order to answer a lot of these questions about what kind of environment I want the game to promote, I will need to spend time learning more about history and what kind of alternate methods have people used to come together. This perhaps sounds like a lot for just a game, but I think more than just a game, I'm spending my time on developing this, so I would like to make it a valuable life experience as well, where I can learn a variety of things. So I think I'll spend more time focusing on enjoying the journey and try to loosen the reins while also being productive enough. I think this is especially top of mind because soon enough I'm going to have to actually implement the business structure of the game. And there are several ways to monetize a game, but I think it can really ruin the game if you choose ones that are predatory or promote too much of an advantage to certain players in a multiplayer game. On an ethical level, I don't like the idea of intentionally making gameplay worse to effectively force people to pay to avoid inconveniences. I don't like promoting gambling, nor do I like having subscription structures where the player can never really own what they've already spent money on. So it's quite a dilemma. I wonder whether there's a way to have a multiplayer game which requires funding development and servers without skewing the game too negatively, or whether this is one of those things where you just have to choose which negatives you want to have. So this time lapse is pretty true to the actual process of creating these monster maps. Things often don't make sense or don't really look good until eventually they settle into something that's more cohesive. I didn't cut out much of this except for one part where the file actually didn't save properly when I was working on the huge hot air balloon. Of course, I also cut out some of the implementing. Other than that, the process is similar to what it looks like. Recording this was actually a very interesting experience. I feel like it really made me think about the purpose of these videos and the kind of content that I myself consume. I also watched a video recently on Instagram resentment reels, and it essentially talked about how people become resentful of having to do whatever their small business is or whatever their hobby is, and also document every step of the way. It is a weird experience because it's like performing for some audience while you're supposed to be creative. I don't know whether I'll do it again, perhaps only if I feel like it's something that's worth documenting for my own uh, satisfaction, kind of like this. Even though I've worked in software engineering, I have a love-hate relationship with technology for sure. I quit social media several years ago and haven't used it since, although I think YouTube more and more kind of feels similar, especially now that I'm uploading things. I don't really like the amount of exhibition, and I think while it is interesting to watch other people do things, it's way more fulfilling to do it yourself. I've definitely fallen prey to the kind of culture of just consuming a lot of content and not really having fulfilling hobbies. So I don't really want to contribute too much to that content. That's why I try to condense the update videos as short as possible, so it doesn't use as much of people's time, and it also doesn't require as much panopticon like living on my part. Probably a more fulfilling life would involve less time consuming content, less time on devices, and more time with your own thoughts. So I'm gradually trying to move in that direction. Although it is very difficult to break the habits and return to having an attention span. So, given this personal goal, I'm trying to figure out how I will change my upload schedule, whether I will change it, whether I'll have no schedule, but then still have regular updates. I'm not sure yet. I think I'll first change my personal habits, try to read more, and I also am going to start knitting because I think it's a good way to do something offline, produce something that's hopefully higher quality with an element of customization. And it's a good general skill to have, especially these days when so many things are so poorly made. I ultimately ended up removing this gingerbread's eyebrows, but looking at it now, I kind of like how it looks, especially with the blush. It looks pretty cute. I chose to simplify it to make it look a bit less creepy, and also so it would potentially be a lot easier to animate. But maybe I'll go back. And with this rainbow, I initially wanted to make it more messy, but I find that Pixar often looks way better when it's cleaned up. So this is the final map. I have a more muted blue but still optimistic map in some ways. Initially, I thought about having it on a cloud 9, but I ended up making it a smoke machine and having this balloon, which would allegedly take people to the skies. It's a reference to the whole to the moon refrain on crypto, which is obviously a scam, and also relates to how the god NPCs are floating on clouds in this game. I ended up making it a wilting willow tree, and we have an icing bag as the NPC. This is somewhat related to the gingerbread because they are decorated with icing. That's all for today's video. If you have any thoughts, I would love to hear them, especially if you watched my usual video updates. I'm curious what you think about this kind of video versus the usual overarching ones that talk about the finished product. Thanks for watching today's video. Subscribe if you want to continue following the game's development, and I will see you in 2 weeks with the next update.